So if you're a millionaire in these states, you pay the federal tax, but you don't pay any state income tax. And that includes big states like Florida and Texas. Then a scattering of other states around the country: Tennessee, New Hampshire, Nevada, Washington State. But this is sort of a reflection of sort of growing polarization on sort of major state-level policy issues, sort of regional polarization, what some are calling a great divergence on social and economic issues at the state level. So how sustainable is this sort of growth in the varieties of elite taxation within a country like the US? Can some regions have systems of elite taxation when other regions do not? And can higher tax states retain their wealthy residents and the tax revenues that they bring in? Okay, so classic Ayn Rand novel, Atlas Shrugged. The rich go on strike. The original working title of this novel was The Strike. And what happens is that the rich withdraw their services and disappear from society in protest over taxes and regulation. And sort of weary of carrying an ungrateful world on their shoulders, business leaders and other top income earners shrug and leave the world without them. And so this metaphor in Atlas Shrugged still inspires political rhetoric today. If you tax the rich, they will leave. So when Oregon passed a millionaire's tax, the richest resident in the state, that's the CEO of Nike, the shoe company, Phil Knight, he warned that this millionaire's tax would set off a death spiral in which thousands of their most successful residents will leave the state. When California was passing legislation, political figures were saying nothing is more mobile than a millionaire and his money. And in New Jersey, my favorite example, former Governor Chris Christie simply stated, "Ladies and gentlemen, if you tax them, they will leave." And this is how the rich threatened to go on strike in the 21st century. I'd like to point out too, though, it's not just conservatives who talk about this. On the left, there is a growing sense that the rich live in a world without borders, that they've become hypermobile and are beyond the reach of state or national governments. The rich are sort of seen as a transnational capitalist class that are sort of beyond the containers of the nation state, moving across the world through networks of global cities. So both sides of the political spectrum are drawing on this narrative of elite mobility, mobile millionaires, albeit for different purposes. You know, for conservatives, they're trying to sow a sense of fatalism, like you can't do anything about inequality. If you try to tax the rich, they will leave and you'll be worse off. On the left, I think they've sort of used it as sort of like a rallying cry or a call to arms. You know, we've got to start doing something. But both sides are drawing on this same narrative, and we want to test, well, how much is this actually even happening? Okay, so here is the ultimate question: mobile millionaires or embedded elites? I thank you for appreciating the goldfish changing his bowl of residence. So what is the connection between the rich and the places where they live? Is place a temporary convenience for the rich and powerful that's readily switched out when the tides change? Or is place part of the foundation for elite success? So are top income earners mobile millionaires searching for low tax places to live? Or are they more like embedded elites that are reluctant to migrate away from places where they've become really successful? So previous evidence on millionaire tax flight has been very limited, and the central problem in studying economic elites is the difficulty of getting good data on them. So in things like the census, top income earners, they get top coded, and we can't look at people who have incomes over, say, $300,000 or $400,000. People who are not even getting hit by this tax. You know, in qualitative research, you know, there's some, but it's very difficult because these folks tend to be very protective of their privacy and reluctant to participate in interviews or surveys, but they have to file their tax returns, and that's where my data come from. So for this project, I collaborated with folks at IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, for the federal government, drawing on a data set of individual tax records for all millionaire tax filers in all states of the country over 13 years, 1999 to 2011. So I have an N of approximately 45 million tax returns, represents 3.7 million unique millionaires. I want to emphasize that this is based on income. There isn't really like a wealth tax in the United States. we're focusing on income taxes. So these are people who made $1 million a year, $1 million or more in a single year. And many of them are doing it on an ongoing basis. But this is what we're thinking about, people who are making this much money.
Sorry, does that include making from, say, stocks, or it's not just income that somebody earns?
So it would include capital gains and so forth. Most of these folks, most of the people who are making $1 million a year or more are sort of the working rich. So they're working as professionals, they're in management, finance, consulting, law, medicine. And about 75, so these people in this data set, about 75% of their earnings come from wages and salaries. But there is business income, there are capital gains, there's stocks and so forth. Okay, so we essentially have census scale panel data on where millionaires live and where they move to. For comparison, pulled also a 1% sample of all tax filers at every income level. This gave me another 24 million observations. The point here is going to run separate migration analyses for millionaires and the general population and sort of get a sense of to what extent the rich are different. How we measure migration is we track people as they change the state from which they file their federal tax returns. So if you file your tax return in New York in 2009, and then from Florida in 2010, that's the measure of migration that we're looking at. From where you file your federal tax returns, then that's where we get people's addresses from. Okay, so I'm going to proceed with the analysis, asking 3 basic questions about millionaire tax flight and just sort of break it down piece by piece. So I'm going to start with a simple question. Where do millionaires live? Do millionaires today live in low tax states, or do they live in high tax states, or what? So here's a simple graph figure showing millionaire density. So this is millionaires per 1,000 population. And what it shows pretty clearly is that millionaires are very heavily concentrated in the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. So that's New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts. Connecticut has the highest density of millionaires in the country. There's some California and Nevada, but this is really where it's concentrated. But now what we really want to ask is like, how does this map onto the tax rates? So I'm basically just going to pull this data down. So this gives you a sort of geographic picture. I'm going to pull this data down, put it on a graph next to the tax rates. So here we go. These are the states that don't have a state income tax rate, and then these are the states that have increasingly higher, up to 10% effective tax rate. So these places are taxing 10% of their total earnings. Okay, so if rich people were finding ways to live in low tax states, these states would need to be bumped up, have higher density in the low tax states, and then density would be declining as the taxes get higher and higher. And call this sort of a face validity, super long-term analysis, but we don't see this at all. It's super flat, and if anything, there's like a slight upward tick because of so many millionaires in New York and California, Massachusetts, New Jersey. But overall, this sort of just says, well, millionaires just sort of seem to live where they live, irrespective of the tax rate. Okay, again, sort of face validity test. Okay, moving on. Are millionaires highly mobile? This is a favored line, you know. There's nothing more mobile than a millionaire and his money. Okay, so is that true? So here, start with cross-state migration. So this is moving across state lines from people who have almost no market earnings to the very rich. I'm starting with the 1% sample of the general population. And yeah, we can see pretty clearly that migration declines with income. Okay, so you know, part of what we think about mobility, when we think about mobility, we're actually often thinking about travel. Travel is a classic luxury good, and the rich do it a lot. But moving across state lines is a really different thing. This is moving your home, your family to a different place and kind of starting over. And it's something that is more of a necessity good. Like people who earn low market returns, who aren't paid well given their skills, have a poor economic fit with place. These are the people who typically move, and that's low income earners. Migration declines with income. Now, so are the super rich different? Well, you know, a little bit. Like there's a grain of truth to this story in the sense that the millionaires, here we're getting to people $5 million, $7 million a year in annual earnings. There's a slight uptick. So, yes, millionaires are more mobile than, say, the upper middle class, but they're much less mobile than the middle class, and they're less mobile than the middle class and much less than the poor. So the poor have an annual migration rate of about 4.5% a year, and millionaires have almost half that, 2.4% a year. So another sort of flaw in the thinking, which I think derives from like a false analogy with travel. Millionaires travel a lot for business and for leisure, but they don't move their residencies. Okay, so albeit there is still some migration that occurs, so how much of the migration, we don't want to just think about any kind of migration, we want to think about tax-induced migration. And for this, we really specifically want to see a systematic pattern of people moving from high tax to low tax states. I've been studying this for a long time, and this stuff gets into the newspaper a lot, and the press do not follow this. The press understand one half of this. So when a rich person moves to Florida, it's a tax-induced migration. But when James LeBron moves from Ohio to California, the highest tax state in the country, nobody says a word about it. So it's really like the press is driving from this selectivity. They understand this, they just don't understand that there's counterbalancing moves from low tax to high tax states that can't be tax-induced migration and kind of count against the thesis. So I've been getting a lot of these calls recently, and so thought I'd mention it. Okay, so there is pattern of net migration across state lines. This is what it looks like. So think of this as a heat map where the states in orange, you think they're heating up because millionaires are moving there. And then the blue states that are cold, and so millionaires are leaving. Temperature per se, I don't know. But so we want to think about the patterns here. So basically what we're seeing is we see net migration of millionaires from the mids, it's the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic, to sort of the non-coastal West and to the Southeast. And then actually Florida, I couldn't shade Florida a dark enough shade of orange to emphasize the importance of Florida, so we're going to come back to this and talk about it some more. But basically we want to ask, is this pattern one of moving from high tax to low tax states? So normally at this point, or traditionally at this point in the presentation, I break out these regression models that you need for, and are informative, but that kind of ends up with like a table of numbers that just nobody wants to look at a table of numbers. While I was writing the book, I figured out that you can actually make a very simple graph that shows you what the advanced regression models show in a really intuitive way. So here we go. Taking all of the cross-state migrations that happened, there was about, we're looking at 45 million tax returns out of that time period over 13 years. There's about 160,000 cases of millionaires moving across state lines. So we take all of those moves and we put them into one of three bins. The first bin is moving to a higher tax state, so that you move from a low tax to a high tax state so that your tax rate goes up when you move. Not tax-induced migration, the opposite of it. Then the next bin is, lots of these moves, about 21% of these moves are just between states that have effectively the same tax rate. And then finally, this is moves to lower tax states. This is the evidence, this is where there's evidence for tax-induced migration. And so if this bar was the same height as this bar, it would be a wash. It's not. This excess migration into lower tax states is where we see evidence for millionaire tax flight. So a fraction of millionaire migrations do at least come with a net tax advantage. It's 15% of them. The other 85% come out in the wash, where the moves to higher tax states are sort of counterbalanced by the moves to lower tax states. Okay, so is that fraction large? What does this mean? Let's think about it. So I told you before, the overall millionaire migration rate is 2.4% a year. We're talking about 15% of those moves come with a net tax advantage. So that's like a small fraction of a small fraction, right? So 15% of 2.4%, a millionaire tax migration rate of 0.3%, 1/3 of 1%. over the long term. So it happens. It's not like it never happens, but it's very small. The magnitude of this is very small. So we can find about 20,000 cases of tax-related migration, tax-advantageous moves over 13 years from an initial data set of 45 million tax returns. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of the population, right? So it's enough to feed the anecdote mill. You can always find someone who moved for tax purposes and write a news story about it, but that's not taking into account the population that was at risk of moving and how many taxpayers you still have, right? Okay, so gravity model of migration. So this is a point I want to make. It's like, you think about the title of the book, The Myth of Millionaire Tax Flight. It's not like it never occurs. It's just that it's so small that it's essentially irrelevant for state policy makers. And we'll drill down on that a bit more. But just want to tell you that this does come from these sort of, regression models that take into account a lot of things. It's not just a simple analysis. So we're looking at migration from origin to destination state. And this is driven by, well, just simple stuff, the number of millionaires in each state, but we take into account the distance between states, contiguity, which ends up mattering a lot if states are exactly touching. There's a lot more migration between them. That's for the general population and for millionaires. Income tax rate on millionaires. Income tax rate has no effect for the general population, but it does for millionaires, as we showed. Also take into account other state taxes like sales, property, inheritance taxes. States that don't use the income tax, they have to rely very heavily on the sales tax. So important to take into account economic performance of states, measures of natural climate like winter temperature, residential land prices. So you knock down the buildings, what would people pay to get a piece of that property? Places like California is extremely high. And because we have so much data, we don't just need to look at someone who makes $1 million a year or more. Like, why not look at 10 millionaires, people who made $10 million annual? We can look at people who are of retirement age. We can look at people who are capitalists, who earn their income not from wages and salaries, but for business or capital gains income. And there's interesting stories to be said about all of these variables, but the overall thrust is like, this is the picture that we get over and over again. There's some interesting things, but the basic story that I've said is very robust to this. One thing that is really distinctive about this is the problem of Florida. It's an odd place if you've ever been there. So this is thinking about Florida's net migration, sort of Florida's trade in millionaires with all other states, Florida being the reference state here. Florida sees out migration of millionaires to two states a little bit, South Carolina and Arizona. Every other state essentially sees net out migration of millionaires to Florida. There's definitely something distinctive about Florida. And so what I wanted to do is just say, okay, Florida's like a distinctive place. It's a weird place. It's not clear what the control case for Florida would be. And so what I wanted to do is just say, okay, well, let's just set Florida aside for a moment and say, well, remember there's a lot of other states like Texas, Tennessee, Washington, Nevada, that have, New Hampshire's up there somewhere. A lot of other places that have that same zero income tax rate. So what are they doing? Are they attracting millionaires like Florida does? And so basically simple analysis, we do it in complicated ways in the journal article, but simple analysis, just to take all of the migrations between Florida and other states and just set them aside for a minute. Okay, so this was the migration flows, what I showed you before, that showed that there's more movements into the lower tax than the higher tax. This is the same graph I showed you before. When we set Florida aside for a moment, this is what we get. Okay, so it's basically just completely balances out. It's just virtually nothing left. So none of those other states are doing any business as a tax haven. It's only Florida. So this ends up being like an important question, what is Florida? This is the main reason why we see any evidence of tax migration. So, is Florida a tax haven? Is it a luxury resort of sorts? Does Florida show the benefits of maintaining a low income tax policy, or does it show the benefits of having coastal access to the Caribbean Sea? I think it's a tricky one to sort out. have additional analyses where I try to, and I generally think it's a bit of both, and it's hard to tease out exactly how much, but I think it's an important thing to note. So as I go ahead and sort of interpret the results further, I'm just treating it all as a tax haven, but just sort of pointing out that that's a little bit, erring on the side of being favorable to the tax-induced migration thing, just sort of giving it to them, okay? How much time do I have? How am I doing for time here? 15 minutes remaining? Okay. Okay. So I'll talk very briefly about a border county analysis, sort of the next step, partly trying to figure out Florida and partly just sort of a more challenging test to take on. But so this was this map of millionaires per thousand population. A lot of these are big states. A lot of the sort of coastal, like California, the millionaires are in coastal states. It's a long move to anywhere. So I wanted to think, and one of the benefits of having big data is you can take big data and make it small and look at really fine-grained analyses that can cast interesting light on this. So turn to a border county analysis. Both Oregon and Washington, it's like the West is huge, Now these are big states, but there's places along them where there's small geographic areas. Thing to understand, Washington state has never had a state income tax, and Oregon for many decades has had one of the most progressive income taxes in the country. And so right along this border, this is the Columbia River, right along this border you can sort of like cross the river for a completely different state tax regime. The distances are small. There's even a multi-state city here, so we think of Portland as being Portland, Oregon. If you think about Portland at all, you think of it as being Portland, Oregon. But a significant part of the metro area is on the other side of the river called Vancouver, Washington. So these are spaces where it should be an easy life move to just find a way to move yourself and your employer, perhaps your business, what have you, to the other side of the river and take advantage of this. And in some cases, maybe even stay within the same state. Okay, so there are these kinds of borders all across the country. I've shaded the darker areas are places where the tax differences are bigger at the border. The blue is like the high tax side, the red is the low tax side, the orange is the low tax side. So we're going to look at all of these sort of border regions. And in addition, I don't have it shown on the map, but there's also about 50 multi-state cities that cross state borders, where you can do this. So another way of sort of thinking about small geography, which should be a lot easier to move. Okay. So I'm just going to sort of skip through this pretty quickly, but how it works is, here's a simple graph of this. So bigger tax differences at the border. Here are places, the decile of border counties where the difference is like 6 or 7 percentage points of real income if you can just move across the border line. And here's where there's no difference. So there should be more and more millionaires on the low tax side over here. And over here, they shouldn't care which side they're on. Make sense? Here, there's a big tax difference. Here, there's no tax difference. When you just plot this, so this is, more on the low tax side. And so it works for that decile. And here here it should be 0, 0, 0. And it should actually just be a mirror image of this, just flipped along the x-axis. So, increasingly people are living on the low tax side of the border. And to my eye, this is just a lot of noise. When you put it with the individual level data and regression, it's just sort of non-significant. It doesn't really come out with anything. Okay, so let's try to think about what these results are adding up to. Should states tax millionaires? I really believe in deliberative democracy, so I don't think I can answer this question, but can states tax millionaires? And this is something that I'm much more comfortable getting into because, these debates about millionaire tax flight, they never say it's ethically or morally wrong to be taxing rich people at higher rates or that there's substantive reasons why we shouldn't ask them for more. They just say, you can't do it, they'll leave. Okay, so this is a positive question that we can take on. It's purely an empirical question. Okay, and this actually comes down to this saying, what's the revenue maximizing optimal tax rate? This was featured in a movie from the 1980s called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And the question that this high school economics professor, he drew this graph and then said, who can tell me what this is? Anyone? 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 This is a Laffer curve. Arthur Laffer famously drew this on a napkin in the 1980s and last week was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for this. He doesn't even have a PhD in economics, but you know, he's now one of the most highly esteemed, honored economists in the country. And anyway, so this is actually a sensible idea that he's put. It's very politicized, but I'll explain it to you. Basically, what this says is government revenue, this is the tax rate, T star is like the optimal tax rate. So first off, you start from very low taxes. As you raise taxes, you get more and more revenue. But at some point, you start getting into evasive strategies. People are hiding money, maybe they're working less, maybe they're moving to different places to avoid the tax, and the revenue starts falling off, and then it can even turn negative. And you know, maybe East Germany knows what we're talking about here, because you know, if you set the tax rate at like 100%, and so that you owe $1 of taxes for every dollar you earn, you know, maybe that's not going to be a tax system that generates a lot of revenue. Okay, so that's basic intuition of a Laffer curve. The only question here is like, what is this optimal rate? Is it, you know, Arthur Laffer would say it's like 5%, like, you know, it should be really low flat taxes, you know, so we can do so here's a calculation for the optimal tax rate that I just take from the economics literature. Just super briefly, this is, you know, this is a parameter for people are hiding money. I don't measure that, I just take it from the existing literature, that when you raise tax rates, people do find ways to report a bit less money. This is a measure of the income distribution. It's just how many millionaires are there? How far out is that tail where there's people really rich? What I'm adding to this is the migration population elasticity estimate. So I'm basically adding to this, and people could move. Okay, and here's what we come up with. Taking this estimate from the literature, basically this says if you raise the tax rates by 10%, by 1%, you'd lose 0.25% in reported income. This is just an existing estimate. It's like pretty small. This is my estimate for the population. So what this says is if you raise the tax rate by 1%, you would lose 0.1% of the population. Or if you like bigger numbers, if you raise it by 10%, you raise the tax by 10%, you would lose 1% of the millionaire population. This gives us, you put these together, this gives us a revenue maximizing top tax rate of 68%, which is substantially higher than what we see in any state in the country in the US today. So if you really just stick with Arthur Laffer and say, no, you can't tax the rich because they'll leave, you can kick in that argument once we get to 68% top marginal tax rate. But right now we're, you know, at like 40, 45, maybe 50 in California. Okay. And you know, more generally, if you wanted to rationalize current state tax rates and say, no, they can't go any higher because rich people will leave, you would need to see migration effects that are 10 to 15 times larger. And instead of a 0.1, you'd need like this 1 or 1.5. You need to see much larger migration flows than we actually observe in the tax records today. Okay. So that was a lot about the US. I think there's lots of analogies with Europe. If you think of the EU as like the United States of Europe, you know, a federal system where the states themselves are setting their own tax rates, and people have free mobility across states. That's the US, and that's Europe today. So I think there's lots of analogies here. But I also wanted to, for the book, I wanted to like get some actual data on not just the US. And also I sort of wanted to go a bit higher up the food chain. So going to the Forbes data on global migration of the world's elite. So taking the Forbes list of the world's billionaires and track migration, where are they born, where do they live, and how do they move? Okay, so basic thrust of this, I started with 2010 and just sort of like scraped the data off Forbes' own website of where these people come. 84% of the world's billionaires live in their country of birth. Okay, so transnational capitalist class. Well, and so then 16% of them live abroad. So that's the transnational capitalist class, I guess, 16% of them. Okay, so let's compare this to, is 16% a lot? For 16% of billionaires living abroad, is that a lot? Well, we think about just the world population. 3% of the world's population live outside their country of birth. This number actually hasn't changed since 1960. So like globalization has happened in ways, but it hasn't involved net globalization of people. What's happened is these flows are increasingly being pointed at developed countries, whereas in the past it would be more, if you were living outside your country, you were living outside your country in another undeveloped country. Today there's like more directional pattern, so that this number's gone up over time. But if you look at just your average developed country, OECD country, about 11% of that population was born somewhere else. And so billionaires, we have 16%. So that's like a 5 percentage point difference between the billionaire set and the general population of the Western world. Not a big difference. There are some population of highly mobile people, and top physicists are an example of this, where 44% of the world's elite physicists live outside their country of birth. So, you know, physics is actually a classic sort of like globalized discipline, where they're all writing in English language journals. Physicists in China, Russia, Brazil, Canada, the US, Germany are all sort of working on the same kinds of problems, trying to publish in the same journals in the same language. It's a globalized discipline. In contrast, elite business is still much more nationalized, at least the headquartering of that. Okay, so and I wanted to dig into this a little bit more because there's some interesting stuff when you look a little bit closer at who are these 16% of the billionaires that live abroad. You see, like, to me, just a really interesting pattern jumped off the board. Just sort of go through the list. So of these 16%, almost a third of them, 30%, they actually moved as children. And that's Sergey Brin is a good example of this. He's a co-founder of Google. He was born in the Soviet Union. His family brought him to the US when he was 6 years old. Today he lives, you know, within 20 miles of his graduate school in Silicon Valley. So these people, their parents were mobile, but these people aren't mobile. Almost 40% moved early career. Typically this was for like graduate school for an MBA or something like that. Vinod Khosla, he's the founder of Sun Microsystems. They kind of like make the internet work. And yeah, again, he moved from India to do an MBA at Stanford, and now he again lives just down the street. So it's really this last third are people who moved after they became successful. And classic person for this is like Richard Branson, founded the Virgin Group. That was like Virgin Records, Virgin Atlantic, you know, Virgin Galactic. Now they've got spaceships. And then he, just to round out the brand, he moved to the British Virgin Islands, which is a classic tax haven, tropical tax haven. So if you look at these 31%, these people who, like, after they became billionaires or after they became well established in their careers, moved, you know, they are all basically living in tax havens. A lot of that is actually the UK and Switzerland, who are not tax havens for their own citizens, but they are tax havens for like foreign-born billionaires who they cut these special deals with. Doesn't make sense to me why these policies are allowed to exist, but you know, in the UK, if you can tell the tax authorities, you know, my true homeland is somewhere else, so like, okay, we won't tax you. And they're called non-doms, non-domiciled. And they have to pay something for that, but it's a fraction of what these people would be paying in their home country. Switzerland does something similar. Anyway, so, but my point is that it's really only about a third of these people that are like the real like mobile billionaires who are sort of unplugged. So we're talking about a third of the 16% who live abroad. This is about 5% of the world's billionaires who like fit this like stereotype of like disconnected from their homeland and are just sort of traveling the world for like cosmopolitan lifestyle and low taxes. I'm going to skip over that graph. So these people are the globals. The other 95% of the world's billionaires live either where they were born or where they launched their careers. So, you know, globalization for the elite is mostly about travel and for business and leisure. It's not about living in a different country. And 95% of these folks are not any further beyond the reach of the nation state than you or I. So wrapping up here, you know, millionaire tax flight. I'm actually going to try and squeeze in one more point after this wrap up, but But just to wrap up a point here, you know, millionaire tax flight, I want to emphasize it does sometimes occur, but the magnitude is very small. It has little impact on the stock of millionaires in a state, and it's essentially too small to matter for current tax policy. It could matter one day if technology changed so that people really started moving in a way that, you know, the technological change that we've seen so far in the last 100 years hasn't produced. But you could imagine if some people somehow suddenly became a lot more mobile in the future, it would matter. And more tangibly, if tax rates went up a lot, I do think it would start to matter. It could matter a lot if tax rates went up a lot. But at the current level of tax differences within the US, it doesn't matter. So California's top tax rate is 13.3%, and Texas is 0. So that difference doesn't seem to matter for folks. If California went up to 50%, I'm sure that would matter for folks, you know? But so I just want to wrap up. What I'm saying with this title, you know, is that it's not a consideration. It's not something we need to worry about for tax policy today. Okay, you know, I think there's lots of social science. I have a chapter where I really kind of try and dig into what this is about, but I'll just sort of briefly talk about it. You know, I think just places are sticky. You know, when people start building their lives in a place, they accumulate a lot of things that tie them to that place. Marriages, children, businesses, colleagues, clients, collaborators. I sort of wrap up and call sort of place-specific social capital. And, you know, a lot of these things are, you know, today, like part of the spoils of economic success. You know, marriage rates are declining rapidly, but they're not for the rich. The rich are very married up. They have a lot higher marriage rates than the middle class or the general population. They tend to have children at home. They tend to own businesses. They tend to have clients where they can't really say to their clients, it's like, okay, we're all moving to Florida. Let's all move to Florida, everyone. I want to move to Florida. It's like, it's a big collective, it's a big coordination problem to make all your clients, you know, so these kinds of things, to convince your spouse or your children that, no, we're going to move to a tax haven. You're going to leave your life behind because I'm going to save on my taxes. Okay, so yeah, there's a chapter on that. I've always wanted to say more about it, but I always run out of time. Anyway, one last point I want to make, I think is really important. This is something that's come up in just sort of presenting it. This is one of the fun things that, as presenting it, there's analysis that sort of developed in response to questions from the audience. But people had sort of said to me, okay, like, this is all really interesting, compelling, and makes sense, but here's a puzzle, here's something that I don't get, you know? Like, don't we know that the highly educated are more mobile than the general population? And aren't also the highly educated, like, the top income earners? So how can it be that, like, the rich have low mobility, but highly educated people are really mobile? Like, what's going on about that? And the thing I love about this puzzle is, like, both those facts are true. And I'll show you how this works. Start with the census. So in the tax data, I don't have data on education. So I went to the census and just pulled like 10 years of the census. And so we're just looking at, we're going to plot lifetime migration rates by education level. So so we're all going to be on one side. So this is people who earn less than a high school degree, and they have low migration at a young age, and it's declining, but basically they have low migration their entire lives, okay? But if you look at people who finished high school or have some college, they do have higher mobility. It quickly converges with sort of high school dropouts, but in these early years there is higher mobility. Look at college graduates. Now we're getting into actually really high migration rates. 12% rate of migration for recent college grads. Remember what it is for millionaires, 2.4%. It's basically the same as high school dropouts. But it's because, and then if we look at PhDs, they have higher mobility again. But the point is that it all happens very early life. There's a narrow window when people are moving, you know, and that's sort of, so the highly mobile people are college graduates or higher who are like fresh out, you know. And by the time people are about 45 years old, everyone has the same low rates of migration. Everyone converges to that low migration rate of high school dropouts by middle age. And the thing to point out, so migration is a young person's game. But what isn't a young person's game is earning $1 million a year, okay? So the median age of a top earner in the census, and these people are making like 250K, but so the millionaires are even higher above this, but it's like 49. The median age of a top earner in the census, 49 years old. The median age of an adult mover is 28, you know? So people are moving and deciding where to settle down and build their careers and their lives about 2 decades before they hit that top tax bracket. So migration decisions are really separate from the period of time where you're at your top income earning potential and you're paying that top tax rate. So I think this is sort of like some unexpected genius of a millionaire's tax, because it does focus on highly embedded elites, late career stage elites, at a time when they're already settled, they're not going anywhere. And if you can use that, so like a non-mobile population, and if you can use those revenues to invest in the things that matter to young people, that's like education, quality of life, you know, making cities work, infrastructure, and make those, and maybe that's like childcare. You know, what are the things that matter to young professionals starting out when they are really mobile? Invest in those things, and you can attract, and I think this is how places like New York and California have been able to like persist for so long as like centers for elite talent while also having the highest tax rates in the country, because they're using those revenues to invest in the city's future and making it an ongoing place that's attractive for young people, for young professionals to want to keep starting out in. And then they pay those revenues in the future if they're super successful. And so in this sense, it's sort of like an intergenerational transfer where late career people are paying the operating cost of making the place attractive for the young in the future. Okay, and that's where I'll leave off. So thank you very much. Should we?
Sure.
All right.
You deserve sitting down. Well, I didn't promise too much, I think. Makes me feel like if 2 billionaires meet in Switzerland in the Alps in their resort, and one tells the other, well, you really got lucky. You were born in the right place. when you pay like much less taxes than I do in this. I have a few comments and questions, but I would actually like everybody else first maybe ask and comment.
You mentioned that your work has been receiving a lot of attention. Can you, are there signs of impact that you've noticed anywhere in the response to your work? Actual practical political impact?
Sure, yeah. So I would backtrack by saying that this topic has received a lot of attention, and so my work has gotten attention because it's an item of conversation. You know, and so when I first started working on this back in 2008, these kinds of arguments were tossed around as if there wasn't a recognition that this was an empirical claim. Like if you tax the rich, they're going to move away. It wasn't understood as like it's just like gravity. Like if you drop a rock on somebody, it's going to hit them. You know, like this isn't this is just a law of gravity. And so the biggest thing that I think has changed in the conversation is recognizing that this is an empirical debate and we can find evidence on this. So that's changed things. And then, you know, I did have, you know, the pleasure of being attacked by Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, during his entire tenure. He made, you know, repealing the millionaire tax, you know, the central sort of objective of his administration. He was never able to do that, but I always found this very aggravating. So, you know, see, most recently, Massachusetts has been working on passing a millionaire's tax. They have it written in their constitution that they cannot have a progressive tax. It has to be a flat income tax. It's in the Constitution. So to change that, it's a multi-year process where the legislature has to pass by supermajority vote 2 years in a row. We're gonna pass a millionaire's tax. So then they did that with lots of debates where, you know, they were asking me to weigh in on this, which I did a bit. And then it goes to a referendum to the general population. And just before, like literally 2 weeks before the referendum, which was polling very strongly, the state Supreme Court said you can't ask that question to the population. And the reason was, the reasoning was that the question said, do you want a millionaire tax to fund education and infrastructure? And the Supreme Court said, well, that's too complicated. You can only ask them about the tax. You can't tell them what you want to spend it on. Which to me drove me crazy because it made me think, it's like, would you like to kick in, $100 into the pot? And you might reasonably say, well, maybe, what's that for? Too complicated. I'm not going to get into all that with you. But anyway, technically it was considered a double-barreled question, and that's not allowed. And
when was the Massachusetts Constitution written?
I don't know when that clause was put in there, but I would suggest in the 60s was the last time there was major state-level tax reform. So, yeah. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating world of state tax stuff, but it has been a rewarding area to be in because a lot of people are thinking about this. A lot of people are concerned about it. A lot of states are thinking about what can we do about inequality, and is this something that's feasible for our state? So, yeah.
Thanks, Christopher. So I work on Russia, as you know, so I'm wondering about offshoring schemes. And I'm assuming that they would be something that kind of kicks in on this Laffer scale at some point, where you might have people who remain residents of their countries of birth.
Mm-hmm.
They still declare a relatively high income, but they come up with schemes to siphon off the lion's share of their income to other jurisdictions where they pay no or very little tax. Do you have any data on that, or how does that factor into your picture?
Yeah, so there's some existing data, some really good work done by an economist named Gabriel Zuckman at Berkeley. And so, yeah, there's some really interesting work on this. We know some of this stuff has come out through like the Panama Papers and other leaks of these shell companies and offshoring strategies. So I talk about it in the book, and I wish I actually had a graph, put the graph up, because I think it's really interesting. So one of the people who appears in the Panama Papers is Emma Watson, who's the actress who plays Hermione in the Harry Potter movies. And so why is she in the Panama Papers? Well, she set up a shell company charmingly called Falling Leaves, and then she transferred her after-tax earnings into Falling Leaves and used it to buy a flat in London for like $4 million or something. The whole purpose of this is because there's a public land registry in London that anyone could look up, and so you could just search it for Emma Watson. If you were like a Harry Potter super fan, you just search it for Emma Watson and then find out her address and then go to her place and camp out. And so now you can't do that. You'd only find out that Falling Leaves owns a property. So this is actually a big part of what the shell companies are doing, because the single biggest users of these shell companies are the Gulf oil states like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so forth. Russia's number 2. Yeah, I'll get to Russia in a sec. And so these are countries that don't have an income tax. So, they're like these monarchies, and it's all the royal family that has the wealth, and they've decreed what tax rate they would like to pay, and that rate is 0. And so they're not using them. They're not using offshore finance and shell companies to avoid taxes. They're using it to, buy up properties in New York and LA and places like this, London and so forth, without attracting a lot of attention, And so then the other 2 places that use it a lot are Russia and the African countries. And I think there's a similar case going on with both of those. So Russia actually has a low flat tax. I believe the tax rate is 20%. They brag about it, and the finance minister has tweeted, the Russian finance minister has tweeted well, when Western Europe finds out what low taxes we have, we're expecting a mad rush of millionaire migration into Russia. And it's like, okay, so that's true that they have low taxes, but they also have Putin. And so, Putin kills people with plutonium just so that everyone will know he did it, And so, yeah, the Russian oligarchs, use that offshore system a lot. I think it's just a hedge against Putin, and making sure that they just don't end up in prison, or at least have their money hidden, so if they do end up in prison, they don't get it taken from them. But and I think something similar is going on in Africa, where you have these oligarchs, natural resource wealth. They're really dependent on the political establishment to protect that wealth and not expropriate them. But do you have thoughts about Russia that you'd like to? Sure.
No, I was just wondering whether that's connected in any observable way with your story about
Right.
kind of migration in response, or lack of migration in response to tax hikes.
Right. So, to broaden it out, then you could sort of say, well, maybe people don't move because they can just move their money, right? And so the problem with that is the offshore system, it works if it works for capitalists. It works for if you've got a lot of money coming in from investments. So most of the millionaires that I study, as I was saying, they have an employer, and most of the money comes from wages and salaries. At least in the US, there's nothing you can do about that, because your salary is already reported to IRS before you ever file your taxes. You can't avoid taxing on it. You can move that money offshore, that's fine, but you'll have already paid withholding tax. In fact, your tax is already withheld. Like you just never get to touch that money. After you've paid taxes on it, you can fairly easily move it offshore, and then you can invest from offshore and pretend you're not an American, and then not report that capital earnings to the IRS. You can do that. But it's a real dangerous game because that's illegal. And it's not like what like Apple and Google are doing a version of this. It's allowed in the tax code. Not reporting individual earnings to IRS is illegal. That's how they got Al Capone. They didn't get him from like homicide and, smuggling. They got him from not reporting that money to IRS, right? So, you can get in an awful lot of trouble for doing this. Some people do, but it's happening at the way high levels of income. The super, super rich, the billionaire set is using this offshore system a lot more than your sort of run-of-the-mill millionaires. So that might explain some of the stuff with the Forbes billionaire stuff. Like, about 80% of Russian billionaires still live in Russia, and I think that's basically true. But they have hedged against that by putting money offshore, not so much for taxes, but for protection from Putin. But anyway, it's a fascinating area that I'd love to study more, and more is going on every day. Yeah.
Just wondering if you could tell us something about how the billionaires get away with that, where the garden variety millionaire is caught like Al Capone. What are the
Right.
mechanisms? One knows that they have some.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the reason why it works is basically because to make the offshore system work for tax avoidance purposes, for pure secrecy, like if you just don't want people to know who you are when you're buying up properties or companies and stuff, it's always going to work. But if you want to earn income without the IRS knowing about it, you have to be extremely careful in what you're doing, because IRS budget's cut, the budget for enforcement's been cut a lot, but they still have deep pockets. And if you show up on their radar screen, they're going to dig into you. And if you get caught, the stakes are super high. It's a felony offense. You go to prison for it. So you need like very sophisticated accounting schemes. You need lawyers and accountants who can protect you if you show up on their radar screen. And that's just very expensive. Setting up an offshore account is really easy to do, just a simple one, but it's not going to protect you if you run into trouble. You need, sort of an army of, they call it the income defense industry, but you need a lot of people to really make that work for you. And interesting, so these companies, they're going around and they're sort of sponsoring sort of yacht races and stuff like this, and just trying to find places where rich people congregate and insert themselves in there, and then like very aggressively market these schemes, and they'll be basically saying like, Dieter, like, why are you paying that tax rate? We can set up a system for you. We'll set up this account. We'll loan money to you. You can still draw money from it. We'll call it a loan. Nobody will know. But, You know, so they're really proactively going after these people. And I think if you're super rich, you're constantly getting people tapping you on the shoulder saying, hey, 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 come on, hide some money with us, you know. We got you covered, you know. But there has to be really high, there has to be big amounts of money involved for it to really be worthwhile. I don't know, does that answer, does it help? Yeah, okay.
Well, thanks very much for the narrative. One, the right, you said you can't do anything about it, on the left as a rallying cry. Now it seems to me that the rallying cry sounds somewhat different lately, with MMT insisting on taxation's primary purpose is not to finance infrastructure, public services, but that you can just borrow the money and circumvent taxation at all. Taxation then only has the purpose of reining in the money supply if things get out of hand. Do you think that's a significant shift in the debate, and what do you make of it?
MMT, can you clarify what?
Modern monetary theory.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Old-fashioned printing money.
Right. So I'm not tapped into modern monetary theory, and I didn't know they're making an argument that it's just a borrowing. So I mean, I guess in contrast to sort of like Keynesian stimulus or fiscal policy, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure what I would say other than that, you know, Trump passed a big tax cut on the rich, thinking that it would provide a bunch of fiscal stimulus that it doesn't appear to have delivered. So maybe that's supporting MMT, modern monetary theory. But I think more of the reason is that the economy was already sort of close to full employment and there wasn't a lot to stimulate. But I'd love to hear more thoughts that you have on this. I mean,
Basically, you can pick your political purpose of choice. You can, so the proponents of MMT argue, you can just print money and use it for either being the employer of last resort if unemployment is your problem, or to have the Green New Deal, as AOC is proposing. And for all that, and the whole Bernie Sanders crowd, they think that it's no longer, taxation is such a hotly debated issue, that if you could do it without changing taxation at all, that's, I think, basically the idea.
I see, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, call me a conservative, a moderate, fiscally conservative. I mean, I do sort of believe in the basic principle of a roughly balanced budget. You know, I think this is something that states in the US should be aiming for, and, you know, I don't buy the modern perspective that, like, we don't ever have to, we can just run, we can increase the debt to infinity and there's no problem with that. I think the historical record of printing money has been like pretty disastrous for economies. So I believe in raising revenue to pay the bills that you think are important, and we should sit down and have a conversation about what's a fair way to share the burden of paying for the things that matter to us. You know, I'm very worried about the US. Like, there's a recession, there's inevitably going to be a recession. I don't know when it's going to be, but, you know, we've been running deficits through a boom period, running huge deficits through a boom period. So that when the recession comes, I don't know how the government's going to be able to cushion the impact of that. I don't know how they're going to pay for unemployment insurance, and, you know, how they're going to cover basic operating expenses when revenues fall as they're going to when the recession comes. So I think it's very irresponsible fiscal policy right now, and I personally am not in favor of printing money. I think that sounds like a very bad idea.
If I may come in here, the modern monetary theory in some way could actually mean that's this return of this free money ideas of Gazelle. I mean, basically that was not much different, no? And there's a convergence basically of this idea to the late Hayek, who suggested basically get rid of central banks and have sort of like anybody emit money and have a competition of currencies which obviously also has not been tested so far. But I was thinking that I want to challenge you a little bit, because I think the information you figured out here is very convincing in terms of demonstrating the that people can be taxed, and so the reason why the story holds cannot be based on sort of like the factual evidence that in fact that would have to show that they run away in droves and so on and so forth. Now, if there's no factual evidence for people to react to the introduction of millionaire taxes and so on and so forth in this way, one still has to ask, obviously, why is the story so strong? And you bring in, and that's the intersection of your work and my work, you bring in Feldstein, who is a member of the Montclair Society, and all these sort of like supply-side oriented economists who have obviously made these arguments, arguments that are then repeated by politicians or media people. Have obviously been theoretical arguments made in economics. You mentioned this in your book. And you basically provide the evidence that factual evidence for private income taxes don't hold, but you don't go into the topic of taxes on business.
Right.
And I was wondering if the sort of like the story would be different, because of course business taxes are much more immediately relevant for competition. For competition between businesses that have to calculate cost for labor, for all kinds of for resources, for all kinds of things. And of course, this is the argument that has been made in the 1970s, that internationalization, globalization, competitiveness forces you to turn from fiscal federalism to competitive federalism and lower taxes. And I would say the personal income tax side is maybe just a corollary of this. And I was wondering what your take is. Is the story a little bit different on the
Business
taxes on
side.
business activities than on the personal income?
Yeah, definitely the corporate tax system is a different story. So, I sort of specifically bracket that out in the book, and particularly when I talk about tax havens, like, look, I'm talking about the personal tax system. Tax havens for businesses work really differently. They're super complicated. It's a whole other can of worms. But the basics of it are that companies like Google and Apple are basically taking their worldwide sales and parking them in a different country, and parking them in like a complicated sort of sandwich of countries. Double Dutch, Irish, dipped, I can't remember, with a Cayman sundae on top, something like this, But so they'll basically say, Apple USA is separate from Apple International, which is headquarters in the Cayman Islands, which is stationed in the Cayman Islands, but which is incorporated in Ireland. And so Ireland says, well, you're not actually in Ireland, so your tax laws don't apply. Sorry, our tax laws don't apply to your company because you're actually in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands says, well, you're here, but you're actually headquartered in Ireland, so our taxes don't apply to you. And so they just sort of slide in the middle and aren't paying taxes on international sales of Apple products, aren't paying corporate taxes on international sales of Apple products. And so then it's all just sort of sitting there parked in a foreign country. If they try and do something with it, like they want to spend that money, then they have to bring it back to the US and then spend it, and then it pays a tax, right? So it's this game of what they're going to do with this. But yeah, these are all of these legal strategies that various countries have sort of hobbled together and have heard proposals on how they should do this. It's all happening legally. Nobody's breaking the law. The companies all say, no, we pay exactly the taxes we owe. We're very honest. We pay exactly what we owe. We've just convinced countries to set up tax laws like this that let us pay no tax. So it has made the corporate tax system a lot harder to enforce these days, and it is being much more aggressively attacked than the individual income tax system.
There's two questions connected to this. On the one hand, if a significant part of the income of some of the because that of course allows Google and Apple to pay huge salaries to their managers. So in which ways would that possibly change the argument a little bit? Because part of your globalized tax advantage system for big corporations allows you to basically generate the incomes that allows the rich to pay taxes even in California.
Right, right. Well, I'll tell you definitely one area where it makes a big difference is unrealized capital gains. So, if you had bought stock in Apple in, 1986 or something, $100 of Apple stock in 1986 would make you a very wealthy person. So you could realize those capital gains by selling that stock and trading it for cash, and then that would give you income that Apple would report directly to IRS. That would be reported income that you would pay taxes on. Now, what happens if you don't ever realize those capital gains and you just have growing wealth? That you can borrow against that. You can live a lifestyle based on that without ever realizing, without ever paying taxes on that. And with the way the inheritance tax, there used to be an inheritance tax that was sort of, putting a back door on that. And they've almost eliminated the inheritance tax. And so, right now, per child, $11 million completely tax-free. They're trying to get rid of it entirely. It actually could happen in the next couple of years that there's no inheritance tax. So then you've got these intergenerational wealth transfers, dynastic wealth transfers, that nobody's ever quite realizing the gains on that, and nobody's ever paying any taxes on it. But they're very wealthy, and they're able to have a very wealthy lifestyle without paying the taxes. So it's a worrisome thing. And so corporate finance. So people argue, well, you could cut the corporate rate, but then balance that out by raising the capital gains rate at the individual level, maintaining an inheritance tax system at the individual level. But those things aren't happening. So it's definitely a worrisome sort of issue.
I think because the argument you make connected to the factual story of no evidence or little evidence for tax flight of millionaires, that there is no transnational class.
Right.
I'm wondering if that's actually possible based on the data you provide. Because on the one hand, you can prove that a lot of rich people are sticking to sort of like their neighborhood. On the other hand, the globalized economy and the different regimes of corporate taxation and such is obviously manufactured by the income defense industry,
Right.
professionals that
Right.
seem to be very easily moving from Europe to the United States to Caymans,
Yeah.
developing global accounting firms for
Yeah.
just for firms with like a professional staff, consulting industries that seem to me that there is something which is not so neighborhoodly, that there's something
Yeah.
where people coordinate in ways that are rather transnational in dimension and that actually cater to those neighborhoodly rich people.
Yeah.
So the question is class just connected to a group of rich people that have to be the 5% of the billionaires you identified? Maybe this is the transnational class, or if we speak of class, we have to think of class formation and ways in which rich people and capital owners and their professional armies are actually able to interfere with so many different systems.
Right.
And cook up the stories that
Yeah.
that you cannot tax the rich.
Yeah. So just quick, I'm glad to hear your thoughts, but I'll just quickly sort of say, I sort of think of, the offshoring system as sort of cybersecurity, So if you're a bank, you're constantly at risk of being attacked and somebody siphoning off a whole bunch of your money. And the response to that is to not just be fatalistic and say, this system's never going to work. You just have to invest constantly. It's a game of cybersecurity. It's a game of having your own hackers who are one step ahead of the hackers in Russia or wherever they are, and that's supposed to be the IRS's job. And so I think we can do a lot to rein in international finance. I think these leaks can be really dangerous, like Panama Papers can be really dangerous to individuals. And I just think if we enforce these better, I don't think the reaction to that is going to be like fine, I'm going to stop pretending I live in the Cayman Islands. I'm going to go actually do it. I'm going to take my business with me. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think we just need more enforcement and more like visible enforcement. Were you on this topic as well,
Or a different one.
or a different one?
No, it's the persistence of the story in the face of lack of evidence. That's the interesting point. I guess we have to look elsewhere, not in the tax system, or not, perhaps not even in the IRS returns, why this story is so persistent. And that may well have something to do with non-economic factors like the world of sports celebrities and the likes, that is movie stars.
Gerard Depardieu.
Yeah, Depardieu. You can. What's the American who lives in France? Never mind. There are countless examples of sports personalities, movie stars, and the likes, and that may shape the story quite independently of what the financial wheelings and dealings actually are, as you said with.
The power of the anecdote is really hard. It's really hard to use quantitative evidence to change people's minds when they have a richly formed sort of anecdote of someone like this. You know, Richard Branson, who's like, you know, just a poster boy for like the jet-setting billionaire. It's like, but there's all these others who are doing much less interesting things. They're just living in their own countries. But it's, can I float another graph, or would that be going too far? I'm kind of interested in hearing your reaction.
Sure.
I'm kind of interested in hearing your reactions. So this is bringing it to the EU, and sort of, I think about Brexit in this, and one of the things about Brexit is clearly, you know, Brits didn't value their ability, the legal ability to live, work, retire in continental Europe. And when the Brexit thing happened, it's like nobody even said, hold on, we're going to lose the ability to live in the rest of Europe, and they didn't want to. And so this graph shows, I got this from Eurostat, just population, foreign-born population in Western Europe. So classic, you know, EU 15, and the percent of any foreign-born, 1995, 2014, which has grown from a little over 4% to about 9 or 10% today. But what I wanted to focus on, the foreign-born people living in Western Europe who are born in a different Western European country. And that started off really low, like 1.5%, and is still really low. And so 1996, Schengen zone comes fully into effect. To me, like, this is like one of the grand experiments in world geography, where you get this huge cluster of countries that essentially erase their national borders and say, y'all can live anywhere you want, sort it out. And collectively, the population goes, I'm good where I am. You know, so there's essentially no increase in people living in different Western European countries after Schengen comes into effect. And, you know, I think when we think about millionaire migration, we're thinking about rich people going to live in another rich place. And Europe is a really interesting case for that. But like, there wasn't like this pent-up demand of Germans who wanted to live in France, or Brits who wanted to live in Belgium, or, you know, Spaniards who wanted to live in Portugal, you know. So nothing really changed. What we do see, this bump here, is when EU enlargement and Eastern Europe, and this is what, about 60 to 80 million low-income Eastern Europeans. The income difference between Poland and West Germany at that time was the difference between the US and Mexico today. So I think of it as like EU enlargement was like as if the US just adopted Mexico and erased that border and said you can live wherever you want in North America. And so this did lead to, as we all know, this did lead to significant migration. So we have this idea that borders are like holding back these huge population flows, and that's really just borders between rich countries and poor countries. And that's where there's demand for migration. Within rich countries, there's very little interest in, like, once you've already grown up in a country, there's not very many people who want to live in a different country. And that's essentially, I think this is like a nice look at what place is sticky, and appetite to move somewhere else and move your life somewhere else is not very high. And we have this idea of mobility, of being this thing that we really value, but travel is fun, but moving is not. And so anyway, I thought, okay, here I am in Europe. I'd love to get people's reaction to this, or people's general thoughts. To me, this is super fascinating.
Generationally, because I think there are big generational differences
Right.
within Europe. But I don't have any numbers on that. It's anecdotal evidence. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence.
Right, right. Yeah, probably like young people live abroad for a while and then go back to their home country.
generation.
What is the Erasmus program? So the Erasmus program had this ambition of like dramatic increase, scaling up their operations like 10 times as much. And they couldn't get like a 25% increase in takers. These are like student, funding to study in a different country. Part of like the EU project, I think it's symbolic of how the EU's goal of mobility of people living in different countries hasn't come to fruition. And it's hard to figure out how to do it, how to have like a more Europeanized population. But
So two related thoughts, and I don't know if they change anything in your story, but I mean the first thing from research on transnationalism, it's not necessarily about actually moving permanently. It's very often about having a transnational lifestyle, right? So if you look at, I don't know, any number of like East European born populations in Western Europe, the typical story is that people will, for example, like live in Germany, have a German passport, but then spend like extended periods of time in Romania, Russia, anywhere.
yeah.
Like have their children spend like 2 months in summer in that country, etc. Or all these Polish workers who go to the UK and might still officially be residents of Poland and have like basically Skyping families, etc. So it's not necessarily about like physically or legally moving your place of residence. It's about having simultaneous connections with all these different countries. I'm not sure that changes anything in your story where taxes are concerned, but I do think that it complicates the image a little bit, right? That's one thing. And the other thing I was
This
thinking,
image in particular.
well,
I just want to emphasize, Eastern Europe is here. There's
Yeah,
huge
sure.
income earning, but differences in opportunities between East and West are
Right.
huge. Different states in the U.S., much less so, right? Which is sort of the point I'm trying to.
Yeah.
Point, but anyway,
Yeah.
but continue.
point taken. Yeah. The other thing I was wondering about is you talked a lot about basically individuals, right? Individuals filing income tax reports, but then you talked about businesses as agents. I'm wondering about families and extended families. Right? There's a large number of countries in the world where essentially, someone's fortune is considered a family fortune rather than something that belongs to an individual. And once again, looking at all these examples of offshoring by Chinese nationals, Russian nationals, etc. Very often what happens is that it's not working millionaires, it's people who have a lot of kind of disposable income, capital gains, etc. That are channeled to other countries through family members, and you still have the person who's kind of considered the head of the family living in their place of birth or of official residence, but then other family members are kind of parked in other countries and take some of the money with them.
So China is a great example of that, right? So Chinese billionaires, they either live in China or they live in Hong Kong. In the graph that I showed earlier, I decided to call Hong Kong a different country. It sort of is. But they definitely have found, I'm from British Columbia, so Vancouver's got a population of, extremely wealthy young Chinese, Lamborghinis driving around on the streets all over the place. Real estate prices are really high. People are very frustrated with it. This was initially began when Hong Kong was reabsorbed by, or taken over official control of Hong Kong, and a lot of people felt like they very seriously needed like a backup plan, and so people moved to Vancouver. But the adult generation themselves don't stay, and so the kids are clearly going to be more global than the parents were. And so this is a good example of that. And so it would be interesting to see what the future holds there. I think right now it's very difficult for you to do business in China if you're not there, you know. But
I would like nevertheless to push you on what he's saying.
Yeah.
Because I think the same problem you point people to who say there's a transnational class, but my data shows people don't move
right,
away from their neighborhoods. Now, your data shows, also in Europe, for example, you know, there's not much movement, but what kind of data would we need to assess possible changes in the composition of a transnational class? For example, I live in a house which is in family ownership still, and every year the family convenes and walks through the house. It's like a three-house complex. But they sort of like are a typical family of, you know, middle class, upper middle class people who earn nice income from the rent, but it's a very moderate rent by Berlin standards these days. Yet we have currently a lot of the reports that BlackRock and other corporations have moved rapidly into the Berlin real estate market, buying up exactly such houses, and of course the income distributed from these properties goes no longer to those local family-owned houses. But you know, you have Norwegian, tons of Scandinavians and other non-Germans moving in, owning property, buying from BlackRock and others, owning property in Berlin. So I would suggest the pattern of living and not migrating does tell you actually quite little about the distribution of your sources of income. And in order to assess is the class of the property class of 2020, in which ways and how much does it look different from the property class of, say, 1980?
sure.
And I think that picture here for Europe would
Is
be
quite
dramatically
different,
in terms of the sort of like composition of
and who's owning property in the major
ownership
cities of
and-
Europe,
and,
for
you
sure.
know, simply due to the kind of complete transformation of the financial system and the kind of transactions that so I would wonder, you being a great quantitative person here, what kind of how would we compile, or what kind of data sources would we need to look at to find out if there is indeed a much more significant story than the story of living in place.
Right. Well, I mean, so for sure, like the ownership structure has changed a lot, and it would be really hard to tell today who even owns, you know, property in these cities, because so much of it gets funneled through the shell companies, right? But I mean, for the arguments that I've been making in the book, it's like, you know, and how I would generalize it to Europe, you know, it's like regulatory and tax policies still reside, the power for that still resides at the national level, at the state level, and I don't think much has changed in terms of the states being able to pull the levers on that. And I don't think individuals or even companies have done a lot to change their fundamental ability to avoid that, have changed their fundamental grounding in their home countries or states. It's just we've backed off on it under the assumption that we can't. And that's sort of corporate finance. It's not like, you know, countries have started a race to the bottom to cut the taxes, and the US is the latest move in that. But it's not because they weren't collecting tax revenue, and it's not because the tax cut is going to improve revenues or anything. It's just an ideological
Redistribution to the rich.
Yes, exactly. So I kind of lost track of your last question,
what
but
kind of data, if your argument is there is no transnational class because
Right.
people don't move.
yeah.
Now, if indeed people do not need to move but can change the properties they own
Yeah.
in a very significant way, so that the collective of rich people, no matter where they live, becomes much more similar.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. So this reminds me of what I was trying to get to is there's no question that like transnationalism is happening, and there's been a lot of things that have globalized, and production is globalized in a big way, and some of these ownership structures have globalized in a big way. But this is something that Saskia Sassen has pointed out, that, you know, in spite of all this globalization, like the headquarter work has actually gone the opposite direction. It's actually even more concentrated. Compared to the 1970s, headquarter work is more concentrated in like the major Western cities than it ever has been. So, you know, it's a wrinkle in our understanding of globalization, but from my perspective, in terms of, you know, can we tax the rich, it's actually a really important one, because, you know, the people who are making this money are all still in the West where they're taxable, right? There's lots of complicated stuff that's happened in the world, but at the end of the day, there can still be brought to account for corporate practices, for taxation purposes, and yeah, I mean, nations should understand that they're still like the fundamental actors in making policy decisions, and they still have control over these systems much the same way as they did in the 1970s, the 1950s, because of the fact that the headquartering is still so central in the major Western cities and countries.
Maybe not quite the same in Europe than in the United States, because of course tax policy is very much on the European level. You cannot liberally change your value-added taxes, and there's much more power of tax harmonization in the supranational dimensions of EU policy making. So I would be worried to think that indeed, you know, I don't know, the Netherlands is indeed in the game of being all-powerful to make the tax decision it wants in Europe. Because that's actually the Brexit argument. Boris Johnson wants Great Britain to move out of the UK, out of the EU, to enable the UK to be more tax competitive. Because within the EU you are much more restrained in your options in this regard. And that's why I'm arguing. I would also argue that the story of local stickiness of elites isn't the full story of a possible transnational class formation. Because the data you get here doesn't tell you about some of the dimensions of policy making. And obviously when Marx was talking about class, national class formation, it was also not just about the rich people clustering in Germany or France.
Right.
It was about shaping parties, it was about shaping policies.
Ideology, for sure.
And maybe just to, because I mean, it's really the interesting question, who is behind these stories? Mm-hmm. Who is doing you cannot raise taxes? Mm-hmm. International competition outlaws raising taxes. You know, if you don't, like stories Feldstein or Herbert Giersch in Germany from the Kiel-Welch Wirtschaftsinstitute would write, but you need more than the one intellectual. You need really a push for this, and I have printed out the graphs from the Economic Freedom Index, which was cooked up by the Heritage Foundation and the Vancouver-based Fraser Institute, and they produced these graphs always since 20 or 30 years, which basically show you your unfree, so accumulate all this data and show nice graphs like you, which shows how countries move in terms of tax burden or in terms of government expenditures. And you can basically ready-made take these data and produce your newspaper story, which of course a lot of people in these circles do. And it's very interesting, for example, even in their own database, you can nicely see how Europe is very bad in terms of making you unfree tax burden, and how Europe is very bad in terms of government expenditure, the two sides, no? So it's very coming down from at the very low end, unfree compared to Africa, Americas, Southeast Asia. So Europe is really bad, completely unfree, looked at public finance. And then the overall score, because there are many other things, they also put graphs on, financial freedom, investment freedom, property rights, and so on and so forth. The overall score, Europe is actually better than all the others. But if you selectively take just tax burden or government expenditure or some stuff like this, then you get sort of like the picture you want to create in a neoliberal perspective.
Right.
And only, of course, if you balance it out by what you get for your money, good judges, maybe less corrupt system because you pay government employees a little bit more. But it's very interesting because these data is a global data set produced by think tanks all over the world collaboratively. So there's a lot of coordination by those neoliberal pundits that actually advance these messages. And I think that data is not captured by looking at this kind of stickiness of neighborhood living of elites.
So what are you telling us, that Europe isn't a horrible place to live?
According to the neoliberals, would admit in the overall score. But you can improve a lot in reducing the tax burden.
Right.
Assuming that the other stuff doesn't get worse then.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to me what the value judgment that goes into saying like government expenditures are just bad. That's taking away your freedom.
That's exactly the
It's true in the sense that like if there was no taxes, you would have some more money in your wallet. But we all want a share. I mean, everyone would agree we want a combination of like private goods and public goods. And it's a matter of figuring out how to balance those two things that we all know we want. And I think for rich people, they're willing to pay a lot of money to have a big mansion. That's their private good, nice cars and stuff. But they also want to live in like a community and like have roads to drive on and not to be they want to live in a community where they don't have to be fearful of being expropriated when they leave their driveway. I think their willingness to spend doesn't end at their driveway. Like they still want to live in a great city, in a great place, and that involves investing in public resources. And I think we can actually have like a great conversation with rich people and reach out to them and say like, we all want the same thing at some level. We want Berlin to be a great city, we want Germany to be a great country, and here's how we're going to get there. But but I think we can have a less confrontational sort of approach and say like we're trying to build something together, rather than just being like any dollar taken from you, that's oppression.
I think maybe that's a good concluding statement.
Yes, I would say so.
I suggest that we migrate downstairs.
That's great.
So thank you very much, Christopher.
Thank you.
Dieter,
It's
for
been
being
a lot of fun. Thanks for that.
And everybody in this room, but perhaps not everybody watching this online, knows that we have our major event coming up starting on Sunday night. Thursday night this week. So everybody's welcome here at the Einstein Forum for a big summer conference. And this concludes tonight's event.
Looking forward to that as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. Christopher will be speaking there as well.